Okay, so today we're going to dive deep, really deep, into the early life and career of, well, I guess you could say one of the biggest names in history, Napoleon Bonaparte.
Yeah, I mean, Napoleon, right. Everyone knows the name.
Exactly. And we've got this really fantastic biography here to guide us. It's packed with details and, serious historical analysis.
So we're not just getting the highlights reel.
No, no, we're going way beyond that. This is about going back to the beginning, like before the empire, before the conquests.
Oh.
We want to figure out what made this guy tick, what shaped him into, well, Napoleon. You picture him like the military genius, the emperor, that whole image. But how did he get there?
Right, like where did it all begin?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And one of the first things that jumps out, right? Like you can't ignore it. Napoleon was Corsican.
Totally. I mean, that's his origin story, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny, once he had power, he actually kind of downplayed his family's background. Like he once told Metternich, some genealogists would trace my family back to the flood. Others claim I was of peasant stock. The truth lies somewhere in between.
So not a peasant, but also not claiming to be from some ancient noble line.
Yeah, he was very much about, I made myself. He even said the Bonapartes were just a good Corsican family, a cut above the petty snobs who looked down on them.
Hmm. So rejecting inherited status. He's all about achievement.
Totally. But there's this interesting duality, right? Like, he might have downplayed the deep ancestry thing, but he still, mentioned his family being Roman.
A race that founds empires is what he said.
Yeah. But the family dynamics are really fascinating, especially with his father, Carlo Bonaparte. He starts out as this hardcore Corsican nationalist, but then, according to his brother Joseph, becomes a good Frenchman.
So a bit of a shift in allegiance there.
Yeah, big time. And, Carlo ends up representing the Corsican nobility in Paris, even goes to see Louis VI, like, twice.
Huh. So he's pretty embedded in the French system.
Yeah, and some people say this caused tension with Napoleon, who was, super pro-Corsican at that point. But our biography here is kind of cautious about that narrative.
Because.
Well, a lot of it comes from Bouillon, and he's not exactly the most reliable source.
Right. Right. And didn't Napoleon name his own son Charles? Doesn't seem like huge resentment there.
Good point. And the biography describes the Bonapartes as this, thrusting, striving, close-knit family. They were what Napoleon later called petits gentilshommes. Definitely smart enough to see which way the wind was blowing.
They were moving up in the world, adapting to the political realities, playing the game.
Exactly. So let's talk about young Napoleon. He wasn't exactly Mr. Sunshine, described as thoughtful and gloomy, kept to himself a lot.
A bit of a loner.
Yeah, but crazy smart and stubborn. His French teacher, Chardon, said, if I scolded him, he answered in a cold, almost imperious tone, Sir, I know it.
Okay, I'm sensing a bit of an attitude already.
Oh, yeah, but also a really sharp mind. Like, think about this. He shows up in Autun, barely speaking a word of French. 3 months later, fluent. Speaking, reading, writing.
Wow. That's like a crash course in language acquisition.
Right. Shows you how determined he was. It wasn't just about fitting in, it was strategic. French was the language of power, the military, the government.
He needed to climb that ladder.
Yep. So then he heads to the Royal Military School of Brienne. Life there was rough, straw mattress, one blanket, no holidays. His dad drops him off. They don't see each other for 3 years.
That's like a huge chunk of his childhood.
It is. Brienne was also kind of weird, run by Franciscan monks, but military training was done by outsiders.
Monks with muskets. Interesting combo.
Right. And when his mom, Letizia, visits in 1782, she's worried about how skinny he is. It wasn't exactly a cushy life.
So this is where he really gets into reading, big time. Biographies of Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, the greats.
Oh, he devours those books. He even wrote his own biography of Alexander. And it's not just casual reading, it's like forming his worldview. The biography says his schooling opened to him the possibility that he might one day stand alongside the giants of the past.
He's seeing himself in those stories.
Totally. Alexander, Caesar, these aren't just names, they're like models for him. He's thinking, I can do that too.
It's ambitious, right?
Huge ambition. And alongside this, he's learning about French history. The good, like Charlemagne, Louis XIV, but also the bad, like, the losses to Britain in the 7 Years' War.
Ah, so that's where the anti-British sentiment comes from.
Exactly. It's not just some inherited Corsican grudge. It's a reaction to what he's learning about French defeats and British expansion. The Treaty of Paris in 1763, Britain colonizing Australia, it's all happening while he's growing up.
So his worldview is shaped by these events.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because later on, he actually admires some British figures like Marlborough and Cromwell. He even asks to live in Britain at the end of his life.
Wow, that's a real shift.
It is. But early on, his heroes are Pauli, the Corsican leader, and Charles XII of Sweden. Both of them had big victories early on, but then ultimately lost.
Almost like a foreshadowing, you know?
Right, that early success followed by defeat, it's kind of eerie. After Brienne, he spends a year at the École Royale Militaire in Paris. It was right near the Champ de Mars, where the Eiffel Tower is now.
So prime real estate.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
But he's so focused on his studies that he barely sees any of Paris.
No time for sightseeing.
Nope. And he makes a choice. Artillery over the Navy.
Why artillery?
Well, his mom was worried about him being at sea, but he also loved math, and artillery was seen as more elite.
It's a technical field, right?
Totally. And he excels at it.
Yeah.
They pick only 14 guys for the artillery out of 202 candidates, and he's one of them. First Corsican to attend the school, too. There's even the story about a classmate drawing a caricature of him defending Pauli, with a teacher trying to hold him back.
So still holding on to that Corsican identity a bit.
Yeah, but then tragedy strikes. His dad, Carlo Bonaparte, dies in 1785. Stomach cancer, only 38 years old.
That's like way too young.
It is. And Napoleon hadn't seen much of him in the years leading up to it.
Must have been tough.
His brother Joseph remembers Carlo being delirious at the end. It might have even contributed to Napoleon's lifelong distrust of doctors.
Maybe even spurred his drive, like, I need to achieve things now.
Right, like a sense of urgency. And right after Carlo dies, he writes this letter to his great-uncle Luciano. He's grieving, and he talks about France being a foreign country, distant from everything he cares about.
So that Corsican identity is still very strong.
Oh, yeah. But then there's this weird postscript where he just casually mentions the birth of the Duke of Normandy. Talk about a change of subject.
That's, yeah, kind of jarring.
Totally. So things are changing in France. It's getting tense. Food riots, Austria and Prussia are teaming up. It's all escalating.
A recipe for trouble.
Big time. And this spills over into Corsica. Salicetti, a rep for the French government, wants to shut down the monasteries. Paoli and most Corsicans are against it.
Clash of ideologies.
Head-on collision. In Ajaccio, Napoleon's National Guardsmen end up fighting local citizens who are protecting a monastery. One of his lieutenants gets killed, and Napoleon tries to take over the citadel from the French regular army, but it fails.
So, bit of a setback for him.
It is, but he's becoming more and more aligned with the revolution. He's all in on overthrowing the monarchy, nationalizing church property. He's a Jacobin through and through.
Radical for sure.
And get this, he's in Paris in June 1792 when that mob storms the Tuileries Palace. Brienne says Napoleon's like, let's follow the rebel, and they watch the whole thing unfold with surprise and indignation.
Tough to say what he's really thinking there.
Right. But he's definitely witnessing history firsthand. After this, his writing changes. He's not just doing literary stuff anymore. He's writing about current events, like what happened in Ajaccio, the Sardinian expedition, and even a plan to retake Corsica from the British.
He's getting political.
Oh, yeah. And then there's Le Super de Beaucaire, this fictional dialogue he writes in 1793. It's basically a propaganda piece for the Jacobins, arguing for their government against the European monarchs and French aristocracy.
Laying out his political views.
And, he takes a shot at Paoli in the text, accuses him of stealing from rich families because they supported the Republic.
Ouch. Burn that bridge, huh?
Big time. So, we don't have all the details here, but his actions at the siege of Toulon are impressive enough that he gets promoted to brigadier general.
Major, jump up the ranks.
A big one. Then he's instrumental in putting down the royalist uprising in Vendémiaire. They even start calling him General Vendémiaire, kind of under the breath.
I mean, he just gave the order to fire on his own citizens.
Yeah, but his quote about that is chilling. A soldier is only a machine to obey orders. He doesn't mention he's the one giving the orders, of course.
Convenient omission.
Totally. But this is a huge win for him, career-wise, and for the whole Bonaparte family. He gets a massive salary, his brothers get good positions, it's their time.
The Bonapartes are on the rise.
So now he's appointed commander-in-chief of the Army of Italy. It's a big deal, he's still pretty young, and he's in charge of these 5 veteran divisional commanders.
Talk about trial by fire.
Seriously. These guys are seasoned, like Serrier, decades of service, Augureau, ex-mercenary, total brawler. Massena started out as a smuggler.
Colorful bunch.
They don't mess around. Their first big fight is at Lodi. Austrians are dug in, defending a bridge, and Napoleon decides to go straight at them. He gives this rousing speech to Delamene's troops. He believed in getting them fired up emotionally. Electrify the men, he called it.
Got to get the morale up.
And it works. French infantry charges across the bridge under heavy fire. There's this group of volunteer carabiniers leading the way, pure French fury.
Bold move, but it pays off.
Big time. More victories follow at Castiglione and Lonato. Augereau retakes Castiglione after a brutal fight. And then at Lonato, Napoleon only has 1,200 guys, but he bluffs this much larger Austrian force into surrendering. Tells them his whole army is there and they've got 8 minutes to surrender.
It's like the next level psychological warfare.
The Austrians don't realize they outnumbered him until after they've surrendered.
Ouch.
Yeah, big miscalculation. But while he's in Italy, Napoleon sees a lot of corruption, people in power looking out for themselves. He's disgusted by it. Says, they don't kill people here, but they buy the judges. It's a complete fair here where everything is sold.
So he's seeing the downsides of power.
And it probably reinforces his own desire for order control. Right in the middle of all the fighting, he creates the Cispadane Republic. It's made up of Bologna, Ferrara, Modena, and Reggio.
Okay, new country alert.
Yeah, and it's revolutionary. No more feudalism, everyone's equal, they get an elected assembly. It's basically the start of the Risorgimento, the Italian unification movement.
And Napoleon's writing their constitution.
He's hands-on. By November 1796, he's writing to Carnot back in the Directory, and he's optimistic, talking about how things are coming together in Italy, the intense battles at Arcole. He even wants to march on Rome.
Ambitious as always.
But he's also getting suspicious of the Directory. They send General Clark to, supposedly explore peace talks with Austria, but Napoleon thinks he's a spy, calls him talentless. Ironically, Clark becomes a really good administrator later on under Napoleon.
Politics makes for strange bedfellows.
No kidding. Napoleon even says to the Directory, send me 30,000 men and I will march on Trieste. Revolutionize Hungary and go to Vienna.
He's thinking big picture.
Continental conquest. So in the middle of all this, he's also writing these super personal letters to Josephine. They're passionate, almost needy, insecure even. Like, he writes from Milan, all bummed out because she's not there, and he says, when I require of you a love equal to mine, I do wrong. How should one weigh lace in the scales against gold?
Wow, he's laying it all out there.
Total vulnerability. But Josephine knows how to handle him. Lavalette, one of his aides, remembers seeing her with Napoleon on her lap after breakfast.
Oh, that's kind of cute.
Right. But also, I guess Napoleon wasn't this big, imposing figure.
More lean and wiry, maybe.
Baby. He also writes to this astronomer, Jérôme de Lalande, talking about how much he loves simple things, like to spend the night between a pretty woman and a fine sky seems to me to be happiness on earth.
So romantic at heart.
In his own way. But he's also hyper-focused on details. Like, there's this story about an Austrian spy he catches, and the guy's hiding a secret message in a cylinder in his stomach. Napoleon even knows the instructions for getting it out if the guy gets diarrhea.
That's attention to detail.
And it's not just about spy games. He cares about his soldiers, hates corruption. He finds out about corrupt contractors and embezzlement. He's furious. Wants to execute them, but the Directory won't let him.
He can be ruthless when he needs to be, though.
Oh, absolutely. When there's a rebellion in Modena, he puts it down hard, executions, builds a pyramid as a warning, no messing around.
Making a statement.
Then there's the Battle of Rivoli. Alvinci is leading this huge Austrian offensive, and the Austrians are smart. They split their forces. Napoleon has to figure out what they're up to, and fast.
High stakes.
In the middle of the battle, someone tells him, Lusignan's troops are behind French lines. Napoleon doesn't freak out. He just says, we have them now.
Ice in his veins.
He figures out the Austrians in the center are tired, so he focuses on Gwozdanovich's guys coming from the east, thins out his own lines, concentrates his forces at San Marco. French artillery and cavalry smash the Austrian attack.
Classic Napoleon tactics.
And the biography points out that he's learned a lot from reading Caesar, like how to use praise and criticism to manage his troops. He'd call guys who were slacking citizens instead of soldiers, but when units did well, he'd be like, your 3 battalions could be a 6 in my eyes.
So he's like a student of military leadership.
For sure. Around this time, he starts working with Talleyrand, who becomes foreign minister. They're both super complimentary to each other at first. Talleyrand says, the mere name of Bonaparte is an aid which ought to smooth away all my difficulties.
Mutual Admiration Society.
And Napoleon compares himself to Alexander the Great, which, classic Napoleon. They end up getting the Treaty of Campo Formio signed with Austria. France gets a lot of land, but they also give Austria Venice.
Interesting trade-off.
Strategic. And they create the Lemanic and Helvetian republics, so the map of Europe is changing. They have this big conference at Respat to figure out the Holy Roman Empire mess. Napoleon's like, yeah, people will criticize the treaty, but if we wanted more, we'd have to keep fighting, and that's not a sure thing.
Pragmatic.
The Directory isn't happy about Venice, but they sign anyway. Napoleon's all, I was playing Vente on stopped at 20. He even sets up a music competition in the new Cisalpine Republic to honor General Hush, who had just died.
Always thinking ahead.
Now, buckle up, because here comes the Egyptian expedition. Napoleon calls Egypt the geographical key to the world. He wants to mess with British trade to India and challenge their navy.
Taking the fight to the British.
Big time. And he's obsessed with Malta. Writes to Talleyrand saying they have to take it to hurt the British Navy, tells the Directory, this little island is worth any price to us.
So what's the official reason for invading Egypt?
3 things: French colony, Asian markets, and a base to attack the British in the east. But, he's got bigger plans. He asks for maps of Bengal and the Ganges River, even requests this guy, Citizen Pivaron, who's an expert on India.
Sounds like he's thinking about India.
Oh, yeah. But the Directory only authorizes him to take Egypt, and they want him back in 6 months.
Yeah, right. Like, that's going to happen.
So he crushes the Mamluks at the Battle of the Pyramids, gets nicknamed Sultan Kabir, which means Lord of Fire, enters Cairo, sets up shop, and then boom, reforms galore. Local councils called diwans, a postal system, street lights in Cairo, taxes get overhauled, no more feudalism, new trading companies, hospitals for the plague, even the first printing presses in Egypt.
Wow, he's not wasting any time.
And all this is on his own initiative. The Directory is not telling him to do any of this.
He's making his own moves.
Total control. He even tells these stories later, mostly when he's on Elba, about how he almost converted to Islam, had theological debates with imams. Supposedly, he gets them to excuse him from circumcision and let him drink wine in exchange for doing good deeds and paying for a mosque.
Sounds a little too good to be true.
Historians think he was embellishing. Anyway, Napoleon's got Egypt mostly locked down, and he turns his attention to Acre. He's got this thing about deserts, says they're the toughest enemy for an army. He even criticizes Caesar for being too harsh on the Gauls. Desaix is winning battles all over Egypt, but Napoleon decides to attack Djezzar Pasha in Acre, up in the Levant.
Why Acre?
He wants to deny the British Navy ports, stir up rebellion against the Ottomans, and maybe even push towards Constantinople or India. He knows it's going to be rough. The desert, the locals, Arabs, Mamluks, Russians, Turks, English, the whole lot.
That's a lot of enemies.
Yeah, and he doesn't even know about Tsar Paul I, who hates the French Revolution and is allied with the Ottomans and the British. Things don't go well at Acre. It's a long siege, they can't take it, and Napoleon decides to head back to France.
Back to Paris.
When he gets there, it's insane. People are going crazy for him.
Right.
General Seabaugh said it was more than just celebrating a returning general. It was like they were welcoming a savior. The Directory's weak, everyone knows it, and they're looking for someone to fix things.
And Napoleon's the guy. Enter the coup of Brumaire.
Yep. It's all very carefully planned out. Lucien, his brother, is involved, along with some key politicians, Bouled de la Meurthe, Donu, Sieyès, Cambacérès. They create the Constitution of the year 8th, and Napoleon becomes first consul. 10-year term, he's got the real power now. They set up this Conseil d'État to advise him, but he gets to propose laws.
So he's basically in charge.
Pretty much. And he gets paid way more than the other consuls. It's not even close. Right away, he calls for national unity. He's like, forget the old labels, Jacobins, Royalists, whatever. We're all French citizens now.
Trying to heal the divisions.
And to prove it, he appoints guys like Bates, who was actually against him during the coup, to be a prefect. When anyone questions this whole unity thing, he shuts it down. Tells the mayor of Lille he's building a wall of brass against the old ways.
Strong words.
No more fighting amongst ourselves. And get this. There's no big purge of people who served in the Directory. It's a clean break.
Smart move. Keeps things stable.
So then there's Marengo. Big battle. Desaix is key to winning it, but he gets killed. Napoleon's super upset about it, gives Desaix and his troops tons of honors. There's this moment where General Kellerman makes a crucial cavalry charge, and Napoleon's kind of dismissive about it at first, but later admits to Bourrienne that it was a big deal.
So he recognizes talent, even if he doesn't always show it.
Kellerman gets promoted, and Napoleon even looks the other way when he does some looting after the battle. Napoleon's quote about Marengo is perfect. You see, there were 2 battles on the same day. I lost the first, I gained the second. Right after the battle, he sends another peace offer to Emperor Francis. He appeals to the cry of humanity and says they're only fighting for the benefit of the British. We are only fighting each other so that the English can sell their sugar and coffee at a higher price, are his exact words.
Playing the long game.
Always. He goes back to Milan and picks up his affair with Giuseppina Grassini, the opera singer, even arranges for her to perform in Paris. But apparently he's not the most romantic guy. Grassini said his caresses were on the furtive side. And there's a story about him saying lovemaking takes 3 minutes.
Not exactly a Casanova.
Back in France, he's all about consolidating power. He realizes religion is important, so he wants to bring back Catholicism. Not because he's super religious, but because he knows people need it. He tells Chaptal, I must give the people their full rights in religion. Philosophers will laugh, but the nation will bless me.
He's practical about it.
He also knows he can't let the church become a rival power, so he needs to control it. But he refuses to bring back the Bourbon monarchy, which makes some people mad. There are plots against him, assassination attempts, stabbings, even grenades.
Yikes.
He downplays it, though.
The blunt.
Then comes the Saint-Domingue expedition. He sends Leclerc with a bunch of troops to the island. They put out these proclamations about freedom and equality, but the real plan is to bring back slavery.
Wait, what? He's reinstating slavery.
Yep. He'd owned slaves in Egypt, and he wants to make Saint-Domingue profitable again. Tells Leclerc to bring slavery back in stages, even warns the locals that if they don't cooperate, all the horrors of war will be unleashed.
The dark.
It backfires spectacularly. Leclerc dies of yellow fever, and the locals resist like crazy.
Disaster.
There's this letter Napoleon writes to Leclerc before he dies about Pauline's bravery and how everything passes rapidly on Earth, with the exception of the mark we leave on history. Kind of ironic considering how badly this whole expedition goes.
Yeah, not the legacy he was hoping for.
Pauline comes back, remarries some Italian noblemen, and Napoleon moves on. Now we're at the Peace of Amiens. Finally, peace with Britain. Celebrations in Paris, France keeps a lot of territory.
Sounds like a win for Napoleon.
It is, but the peace is fragile. Britain didn't get much out of it, so they're not really committed. There's this whole thing about Malta. They don't recognize the new Grand Master, and they're dragging their feet on giving back Pondicherry.
So it's a ticking time bomb.
Pretty much. They're also worried, totally unfounded, that France and Russia are going to carve up the Ottoman Empire.
They're paranoid.
Back in France, things are moving along. The Senate wants to extend Napoleon's term as first consul, and then there's this push to make him consul for life. He pretends to be hesitant, all if the nation wishes it, but come on, they hold a plebiscite and he wins. Big surprise.
Rigged election.
Almost certainly. But by 1803, the peace with Britain is falling apart. Talks break down, the British ambassador leaves Paris, and they start issuing letters of marque, basically licenses for privateers to attack French ships.
Back to war.
Yep. Lord Malmesbury thought Napoleon would back down because he was afraid of war, but nope. And Whitworth thought the war would hurt Napoleon's power, but again, wrong. Napoleon's not intimidated.
So it sets it off.
It's complicated, but the Duc d'Enghien affair definitely doesn't help. French intelligence is saying d'Enghien is involved with the British, might even be part of a future invasion. They've got letters he wrote to William Wickham and Spencer Smith talking about how his old comrades are waiting for the order to strike.
So he's a threat.
He's not directly involved in the cadoodle plot, but he's definitely ready to act. The evidence is flimsy, but Napoleon sees this as a way to send a message to Louis VIII, the Bourbon pretender.
Make an example of him.
Napoleon comes back to the Tuileries, gets into this argument with Marat about it. d'Enghien is taken to Vincennes, which has a, colorful history of imprisoning important people.
Lots of ghosts in those walls.
Napoleon tells Marat to finish the business that night. He even writes out a bunch of questions for Rial to ask d'Enghien during the interrogation.
Hands-on, even in this.
General Hulin is the president of the court-martial, and he protests later, but that night, d'Enghien is executed. Then we've got the creation of the Legion of Honor. This happens during a meeting of the Conseil d'État. Berlier, one of the counselors, is all cynical about it, like, why bother with these honors? Napoleon just destroys him with this speech about how people are motivated by these things, how the French need recognition. He says, "You tell me that class distinctions are baubles used by monarchs. Well, it is with such baubles that men are led. The French are not changed by 10 years of revolution. They are what the Gauls were, fierce and fickle. They have one feeling, honor. A government exists, yes, and power, but the nation itself, what is it? Scattered grains of sand."
Powerful stuff.
It shows how deeply he understands the French psyche. Meanwhile, the third coalition is forming. Britain, Sweden, Russia are the main players at first. They even signed this financial agreement. Austria and Portugal join later. Napoleon tries to stop others from joining. He sends this letter to Maria Carolina, the Queen of Naples.
What does he say?
He calls her out, says he knows she's been secretly plotting against him, reminds her how badly the last coalitions went for her. He even tells her she'll lose her kingdom if she keeps it up.
Direct threat.
He demands she fire Sir John Acton, her main advisor, and kick out the British ambassador. But she ignores him.
Bold move.
Eventually, though, Naples does sign a neutrality treaty with France.
So she backs down.
For now. But then comes the Battle of Cape Finisterre, a big naval defeat for the French. Napoleon's furious. He's like, what a navy, what an admiral, what useless sacrifices. And with Austria mobilizing, he has to make a choice.
The invasion of Britain's off?
He postpones it. He tells Cambacérès, my army is superb. If only I could have landed in England, I should have been master of the world. But he's also decisive. He writes to Talleyrand, my mind is made up. I want to attack Austria and to be in Vienna before November to face the Russians, should they present themselves.
Switching gears.
Big time. He tries to get Villeneuve, his admiral, to sail north, even though the British fleet is out there. He writes, if you can appear here for 3 days or even 24 hours, you'll have achieved your mission. We could all die without regretting life. But Villeneuve hesitates, and the invasion plan is shelved.
So it's Austria now.
Full focus. He's impatient, though. He's frustrated with Murat and Bernadotte for being slow. Even says about Bernadotte, he made me lose one day, and on one day depends the fate of the world. I would not have let one man escape. He gets to Znaim and finds out about Trafalgar, but he censors the news back in France.
Can't let bad news hurt morale.
His army's smaller than he'd like because he's had to leave troops behind to garrison towns and protect supply lines. The Prussians and Austrians are in a threatening position, but he keeps his cool. There's this story about an Austrian officer coming to the French lines and demanding surrender, and a French sentry tells him, tell your general that we will surrender when we have no more powder and shot. When Napoleon hears about this, he's thrilled and gives the sentry a reward.
Loves that defiance.
He calls in Bernadotte and Davout urgently. Davout makes this incredible forced march to get there in time. The Allies think they've got Napoleon trapped, but he's got a plan. Prince Johann of Liechtenstein comes to negotiate at Staroposta, and General Dumas says, I had served with the emperor for a long time and I had never seen him so happy.
He's got him right where he wants him.
Austerlitz. It's a masterpiece.
Yeah.
He lures the Allies into this trap, using the terrain perfectly. His timing is impeccable. His troops are disciplined and organized.